There's a number that quietly defines a place more than anything else, and most people don't notice it until they compare it side by side with somewhere else. It's not the skyline, it's not the weather, it's not even the population. It's the price of a home. Because that number answers a deeper question. How much demand is left in a place? Over the last 5 to 7 years, the U.S. housing market has gone through one of the most extreme cycles in modern history. Between 2020 and early 2022, record low mortgage rates and pandemic-driven migration pushed home prices up across the country. Markets surged at unprecedented speeds, but then, starting in 2022, the cycle reversed. Mortgage rates climbed back towards 6%, affordability tightened, and demand cooled. And through all of that, something important happened. Not every city moved the same way. Some places surged and stayed high, others surged and flattened, and a few never really surged at all. Those are the places we're focusing on today, because when a city stays cheap, even during a nationwide housing boom, it tells you something deeper. It tells you demand, real, sustained demand, never fully returned. 1. Detroit, Michigan. Detroit is the clearest example of how housing prices follow long-term demand, and what happens when that demand never fully returns. Before the pandemic, Detroit's housing market was already deeply discounted due to decades of population loss and industrial decline. Entering 2020, prices were low, and supply remained high relative to demand. During the pandemic housing boom between 2020 and 2022, Detroit did see price increases, but those gains were uneven. Some neighborhoods, especially closer to downtown, experienced stronger demand and rising prices, but much of the city did not. That's because Detroit's housing market is not unified. It's fragmented into micro-markets with very different demand profiles. Even when prices rose, they rose from an extremely low base. A 40% increase on a $60,000 home still leaves it well below national averages. So the boom never fundamentally changed Detroit's affordability. When mortgage rates increased after 2022, Detroit's market slowed quickly. Unlike supply-constrained markets, Detroit still has excess housing stock. That oversupply acts as a ceiling on prices. Between 2018 and 2025, Detroit's median prices have remained under $100,000, while national medians crossed $400,000. In some neighborhoods, vacancy remains elevated. Buyers often face renovation costs that significantly increase real investment. Today, demand is driven by investors and selective local buyers. The opportunity is localized growth. The risk is broad, weak demand. Detroit will likely remain split between recovery and stagnation. 2. Flint, Michigan. Flint's housing story is defined by confidence more than pure economics. Before COVID, Flint was already one of the cheapest housing markets in the United States, with median values far below national averages. That meant it entered the 2020 housing boom from a very weak baseline. Between 2020 and 2022, when low mortgage rates drove demand across the country, Flint did see some price increases, but they were limited. Unlike fast-growing markets, Flint did not attract large inflows of new residents or investors. Demand remained largely local. One of the key reasons is perception. Housing markets are driven by expectations, and Flint has struggled with long-term confidence issues. Even during a national boom, that perception limited how much demand could increase. When mortgage rates rose after 2022, Flint did not experience a sharp slowdown because it never experienced a sharp rise. Prices stabilized at already low levels. In real terms, homes in Flint often remain below $80,000, making it one of the cheapest markets in the country. The buyer base consists mainly of local residents and small investors seeking low entry costs. Institutional buyers and large-scale migration are minimal. The opportunity is extremely low cost of entry, but the risk is limited appreciation as demand remains weak. Looking ahead, Flint's housing market is unlikely to change significantly without a major shift in economic perception or population growth. 3. Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland represents a housing market that is affordable not because of collapse, but because of uneven recovery. Before the pandemic, Cleveland had a stable economic base, supported by healthcare and education. During the 2020 to 2022 housing boom, Cleveland saw moderate price increases. However, growth was uneven. Some neighborhoods saw strong appreciation, while others remained flat. This created a fragmented housing market. When mortgage rates increased after 2022, Cleveland slowed but did not decline sharply. Because prices had not surged excessively, there was less need for correction. Today, Cleveland remains affordable, with median prices often well below national averages. Buyers include local residents, younger professionals, and small investors targeting specific neighborhoods. The opportunity lies in identifying areas of growth. The risk lies in assuming the entire city is recovering equally. Looking forward, Cleveland will likely remain a mixed market, with both improving and stagnant areas coexisting. 4. Toledo, Ohio. Toledo's housing market is defined by stability rather than volatility. Before COVID, it was already an affordable city with steady demand. During the housing boom, Toledo saw gradual price increases, but not the dramatic surges seen in other markets. This is because the city did not experience strong migration or investor-driven demand. When mortgage rates increased after 2022, Toledo stabilized quickly. Prices today remain relatively low, often around $100,000 to $120,000. The buyer base is primarily local, first-time buyers, families, and small investors. This creates a predictable but slow-moving market. The opportunity is stability and affordability. The risk is limited growth. Looking ahead, Toledo will likely remain affordable unless there is a major shift in population or economic activity. 5. Gary, Indiana. Gary highlights one of the most misunderstood dynamics in housing: proximity without participation. Despite being just outside Chicago, Gary has not benefited from the same demand spillover seen in other satellite cities. Before the pandemic, Gary's housing market was already deeply discounted due to decades of industrial decline and population loss. Entering 2020, prices were extremely low and demand was limited. During the 2020 to 2022 housing boom, Gary did see price increases, but largely because it started from such a low base. Percentage growth appeared strong, but absolute prices remained low. A home rising from $50,000 to $80,000 still leaves it far below national averages. When mortgage rates increased after 2022, demand slowed again. Unlike high-growth suburbs, Gary did not have strong job growth or population inflows to sustain momentum. Today, the buyer base is heavily investor-driven. Many purchases are made for rental income rather than owner occupancy. It's common to see buyers acquiring multiple low-cost properties rather than families moving into the city at scale. In real-world terms, some neighborhoods still struggle with vacancy and infrastructure challenges, which further limits demand. The opportunity lies in extremely low entry prices and potential rental yield. But the risk is clear. Without sustained demand, appreciation remains uncertain. Looking forward, Gary's housing market is unlikely to experience sustained growth unless there is meaningful economic development or population inflow. Until then, it will remain one of the clearest examples of how cheap housing reflects weak demand fundamentals. 6. Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown represents a housing market that has already gone through its major correction and is now in a phase of stabilization. Before the pandemic, Youngstown had one of the lowest housing price levels in the country, driven by long-term population decline and industrial contraction. During the housing boom, prices did increase, but again, from a very low base. Between 2020 and 2022, some demand emerged from affordability-driven buyers, but it was limited. When mortgage rates increased, the market slowed but did not collapse. Today, prices remain low, often below $150,000. The buyer base consists primarily of local residents and small investors. Many purchases are driven by affordability rather than investment growth. In some cases, homes are passed through local networks rather than entering highly competitive markets. The opportunity lies in extremely low cost of ownership. The risk is limited appreciation potential. Looking forward, Youngstown is likely to remain stable but cheap. Its trajectory depends more on long-term demographic trends than short-term market cycles. 7. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh stands apart from other cities on this list because its affordability is not driven by collapse, but by controlled growth. Before the pandemic, Pittsburgh had already transitioned into a diversified economy supported by healthcare, education, and technology sectors. Between 2020 and 2022, prices increased steadily, but not dramatically. Unlike cities such as Austin or Phoenix, Pittsburgh did not experience a surge driven by migration. When mortgage rates increased, the market flattened rather than declining sharply. Today, prices remain relatively affordable compared to national averages. The buyer base includes professionals, students, and local residents. Demand is stable and diversified. The opportunity lies in long-term stability and livability. The risk is slower appreciation compared to high-growth markets. Looking forward, Pittsburgh is likely to continue gradual growth rather than rapid price increases. Over the past 5 to 7 years, Pittsburgh's housing market has shown one of the most consistent growth patterns among mid-sized U.S. cities. While prices did rise during the pandemic period, the increases were measured, reflecting a market anchored by stable employment sectors rather than speculative demand. Median home values have remained well below national levels, even as broader U.S. prices surged, reinforcing Pittsburgh's position as an affordability outlier among economically stable metros. In real terms, this creates a market where buyers are less driven by urgency and more by long-term planning. Neighborhoods close to universities, hospitals, and tech corridors tend to see stronger demand, while others remain more moderately priced. This localized demand pattern prevents the kind of rapid, citywide price escalation seen elsewhere. Looking ahead, Pittsburgh's trajectory is likely to remain steady. Continued investment in healthcare, education, and technology could support gradual appreciation, but without large-scale migration inflows, prices are unlikely to accelerate sharply, preserving affordability even as the market evolves. 8. St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis remains affordable due to balanced demand and moderate economic growth. Before the pandemic, prices were already below national averages. During the housing boom, prices increased, but not dramatically. Between 2020 and 2022, demand was driven primarily by local buyers rather than migration. When mortgage rates increased, the market stabilized quickly. Today, affordability remains intact. The buyer base consists mainly of local residents and first-time buyers. The opportunity lies in stability. The risk lies in limited growth. Looking forward, St. Louis will likely remain affordable relative to national markets. Over the past 5 to 7 years, St. Louis has followed a steady but restrained growth pattern compared to faster-moving U.S. markets. While home prices did rise during the pandemic period, they did so from a relatively low base and remained well below national medians, which crossed $400,000 in recent years. This reflects a market where supply and demand have stayed relatively balanced, without the sharp imbalances seen in high-growth regions. In practical terms, housing activity in St. Louis tends to be driven by local life stage moves, first-time buyers entering the market, families upgrading within the region, and long-term residents relocating within the metro area. Unlike migration-driven cities, there has been limited external demand to push prices significantly higher. Looking ahead, St. Louis is likely to continue this pattern of moderate, stable growth. While certain neighborhoods may see stronger appreciation due to redevelopment or location advantages, the broader market is expected to remain affordable, with price increases tied more closely to income growth than speculative demand. 9. Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham's affordability is tied to income levels rather than population decline. Before the pandemic, prices were already relatively low. During the housing boom, prices increased but remained aligned with local wages. When rates increased, demand slowed. Today, the market remains affordable. The buyer base is largely local. The opportunity is accessibility. The risk is limited appreciation. Looking forward, Birmingham is likely to remain affordable unless demand increases significantly. Over the past 5 to 7 years, Birmingham's housing market has followed a slower and more controlled trajectory compared to national trends. While many U.S. cities saw rapid double-digit appreciation between 2020 and 2022, Birmingham's price growth was more measured, largely because local incomes acted as a natural ceiling on how far prices could rise. This created a market where affordability was preserved even during peak demand periods. In real-world terms, this means buyers in Birmingham are often purchasing based on long-term affordability rather than speculation. Many transactions involve first-time homeowners or families upgrading within similar price brackets, rather than large inflows of external demand. Unlike boom markets, bidding wars and extreme price jumps are less common. Looking ahead, Birmingham's trajectory depends heavily on economic expansion and income growth. Without stronger job creation or migration inflows, the market is likely to remain stable but relatively flat. This positions Birmingham as a consistently affordable market, but one where significant price acceleration is unlikely without a fundamental shift in demand dynamics. 10. Rockford, Illinois. Rockford represents a low-cost market that experienced growth but remained affordable. Before the pandemic, prices were extremely low. During the housing boom, prices increased significantly in percentage terms, but because they started from a low base, they remain affordable. Over the past 5 to 7 years, Rockford has quietly moved from one of the most stagnant housing markets in the Midwest to one of the faster-growing low-cost markets. Between 2020 and 2022, price growth accelerated as buyers priced out of Chicago, and surrounding suburbs began looking for more affordable alternatives within driving distance. However, even after those gains, median home prices have remained far below both state and national averages, reinforcing how low the starting point was. Today, the buyer base includes locals and investors. There is also a small but noticeable segment of buyers relocating from higher-cost areas, particularly those willing to trade commute times for affordability. In practical terms, this means entry-level homes that once saw little competition are now seeing moderate demand, though not enough to create sustained price pressure across the entire city. The opportunity lies in growth potential. The risk lies in demand sustainability. Looking forward, Rockford is likely to remain affordable with moderate growth. For prices to move meaningfully higher, the city would need consistent inflows of residents or stronger local economic expansion. Without that, Rockford is likely to continue its current path: modest appreciation layered on top of a fundamentally low-cost housing base. Final thought. What makes this even more striking is what happened everywhere else. During the same period that cities like Detroit, Flint, and Toledo remained under $100,000 to $150,000, other parts of the country were moving in the opposite direction entirely. Cities like Austin, Phoenix, Tampa, and Boise saw home prices jump 40%, 50%, even 60% in just 2 years between 2020 and 2022. In those markets, demand didn't just return, it exploded. Remote work, migration, and low interest rates pulled buyers in at scale, creating intense competition and pushing prices far beyond what local incomes could support. But that surge didn't last the same way everywhere. Once mortgage rates rose after 2022, many of those high-growth markets began to flatten or even decline slightly. Demand cooled, affordability dropped, and the same buyers who had rushed in started pulling back. But here's the key difference. Even after slowing down, those markets stayed expensive. Prices didn't return to pre-pandemic levels because the demand base, even if weaker, was still fundamentally strong. That's what separates those cities from the ones on this list. Places like Detroit or Youngstown didn't just miss the boom, they revealed something deeper. They showed what happens when a market never builds enough sustained demand to begin with. Even at the peak of one of the strongest housing booms in modern history, these cities didn't fully participate, and when the cycle reversed, there was no excess to correct, because there was never enough demand to inflate prices in the first place. In a way, these cities didn't just stay cheap, they stayed disconnected from migration flows, disconnected from investor attention at scale, and in some cases, disconnected from the broader economic momentum that drives housing demand across the country. That's why their affordability persisted, not as an opportunity waiting to be discovered, but as a reflection of something structural. Because housing markets don't just rise when homes are cheap, they rise when people believe in the future of a place. And over the last 5 to 7 years, the biggest divide in the US housing market hasn't just been expensive versus affordable, it's been belief versus hesitation. Some cities attracted belief, and prices surged. Others held on to hesitation, and prices stayed low. And until that underlying belief changes, so will the prices.